Number 1. The Quackers. Picture a Soviet submarine deep in the Barents Sea in the 1960s. The boat is running quiet. The only job that matters is listening. Then the sonar operator hears something he cannot explain. It is not the grind of machinery. It is not the song of a whale. It is a croaking, pulsing sound, like a frog or a duck made of pressure and water. The Soviet crews gave it a name. They called these contacts Quackery, the Quackers. What made the Quackers terrifying was not the sound alone, it was the behavior. According to the accounts that have surfaced after the Cold War, the croaking would begin only after a submarine entered an area. It was as if the sound was answering the boat. It would change its bearing, shift its frequency, and seem to circle the hull. Crews reported that the contacts could move faster than their own submarines, which could push close to 30 knots beneath the surface. Then, after a few minutes, or sometimes the better part of an hour, the sound would simply stop. There was no wreckage, there was no oil slick, there was nothing on the surface at all. The Soviet Navy took it seriously enough to study it. Reports describe a dedicated effort within the Northern Fleet to log and analyze the encounters. Standing orders generally told commanders not to provoke whatever was out there. No confirmed weapon was ever fired in a verified case. The contacts were tracked, recorded, and then lost, over and over again, across years. So what were the Quackers? There are several competing answers, and none of them closes the file completely. The mainstream explanation points to marine life. Killer whales, large schools of fish, or unfamiliar cetacean calls could all have been misread by operators staring at primitive passive sonar displays. A second mainstream answer is more humbling. Early passive sonar was easy to fool. Self-noise from the submarine's own hull, flow over the sensors, and interference patterns could all create the impression of an outside contact that was never really there. A third explanation comes from the Cold War itself. Both sides were testing quiet acoustic devices and early underwater drones. It is entirely possible the Soviets were detecting NATO equipment built specifically to probe their boats. And then there is the fringe explanation, the one that filled Russian magazines after the Soviet collapse. Some writers, including the former submariner and ufologist Vladimir Azhaja, framed the Quackers as unidentified submerged objects, machines, or creatures of unknown origin patrolling the deep. Here is the honest problem. Western sonar literature barely mentions the Quackers. The accounts we have come largely from memoirs and post-Soviet television. There is no recording that the whole world has examined. There is no specimen in a jar. The bioacoustic libraries that scientists rely on have grown enormously since the 1970s, and many sounds that once seemed alien now have clear animal sources. The Quackers may well join that list one day. Many of the encounters were logged near deep trenches and continental slopes. Exactly the places where cold layers and steep terrain bend sound into knots and make a contact seem to move when it never did. The sound was also described as rhythmic and pulsed, not the steady drone you would expect from machinery, which is part of why crews struggled to file it under anything familiar. For now, the Quackers remain a sound with no body, and that leads to a darker kind of case. Because at least the Quackers left nothing behind. The next contact left something on the hull. Number 2. The USS Stein Incident. The USS Stein was a Knox-class frigate commissioned in 1972 and serving in the Pacific. It was an ordinary warship doing ordinary work until a routine problem turned into something no one could explain. Late in the 1970s, in an event commonly dated to 1978, the Stein's sonar began to underperform. The crew brought her into dry dock to find out why. What they found is one of the strangest entries in naval history. The ship's bow carried a large sonar dome, the housing for its ANSQS-26 system. That dome was covered in a thick rubberized coating, a material designed to reduce flow noise and keep marine growth from fouling the sensors. When inspectors examined it, they found the rubber scored with cuts. Not one or two scratches, but numerous gouges spread across a large fraction of the dome's surface. And embedded inside many of those cuts were sharp, curved structures. They looked like claws. They looked like hooks. Marine specialists who examined the hooks recognized the shape. Squid tentacles are tipped with clubs, and on many species those clubs are armed with hard, curved, chitinous hooks for gripping prey. The cuts on the Stein's dome matched that pattern. The animal had gripped the hull and dragged. But there was a catch, and it is the reason this case never died. The recovered hooks were reportedly far larger than those of any squid known to science. That single fact is what makes the Stein incident so unsettling. The natural reference points are the giant squid, Architeuthis, and the colossal squid, Mesonicoteuthis, which would only be well documented in later decades. Yet the hook suggested an animal beyond the measured sizes of those species. The dome sat several meters below the waterline at the bow, which means this contact happened underwater, in the dark, against a moving warship. No animal was ever captured. None was filmed. There is no carcass. The entire case rests on the physical residue left in a sheet of rubber, so the explanations divide along a familiar line. The mainstream reading is the cautious one. It was probably a large but ordinary squid, and the size estimates of the hooks were exaggerated or measured imprecisely in the rush of a dry dock inspection. The alternative reading takes the measurements at face value and suggests an unknown, larger cephalopod living in deep water, rarely seen because it rarely comes near anything we can observe. There is a third angle worth holding. The Stein case sits at the center of a real scientific debate about how big colossal squid actually grow. Most known specimens come from stomachs of sperm whales or from accidental catches, and these are not always full-grown adults. If the largest individuals stay deep and avoid us, then a hull dragged across the dark could be exactly the kind of accidental contact that hints at a size we have never properly recorded. Skeptics make one strong point. No preserved sample survives for modern analysis. We cannot put the hooks under a microscope today. The story endures precisely because the evidence was real, documented inside the Navy, and yet the source was never named. A sound with no body. A body with no animal. The next case removes even the hull and replaces it with pure speed. Number 3, the AUTEC fast movers. Off the coast of the Bahamas lies a stretch of deep water called the Tongue of the Ocean. It is steep, dark, and extraordinarily deep, which is exactly why the United States Navy built a testing range there. It is called AUTEC, the Atlantic Undersea Test and Evaluation Center, one of the most heavily instrumented patches of ocean on the planet. And not far away lies the deepest scar in the Atlantic, the Puerto Rico Trench, which plunges to about 8,400 meters, roughly 27,500 feet, at a point called the Brownson Deep. It is against this backdrop that one of the great Cold War sonar legends was born. Accounts describe Navy sonar operators tracking submerged objects that should not have been possible. The objects moved fast. In some retellings, the speeds exceeded 100 knots, a velocity no submarine or torpedo of the era could approach. They also moved deep. Some accounts placed them below 20,000 feet, far beneath the crush depth of any vessel a human could ride inside. And they did not move like falling debris. They seemed to turn, to climb, to maneuver, as if something was steering. These reports were gathered and popularized outside official channels. The naturalist Ivan T. Sanderson collected underwater anomaly cases in his 1970 book, Invisible Residents. The physicist Bruce Maccabee and others added more accounts over the years. They gave the phenomenon a name that mirrors the sky. A UFO is an unidentified flying object. These were USOs, unidentified submerged objects. The explanations split sharply. The first mainstream answer is the most likely. Sonar is easy to deceive, and a contact that seems to scream across the trench at impossible speed is often an artifact. Sound, bouncing through thermal layers, can produce false targets, doubled returns, and wildly wrong speed estimates. A second mainstream answer leans on secrecy. The Navy was testing experimental hardware in those waters. Operators on one exercise were not always told what another program was running, so a classified test vehicle could easily look like an intruder. The deep ocean makes all of this worse. The sound channel that carries noise across entire oceans also bends the paths that sonar relies on to judge range and speed. A distant ordinary object can appear close and fast. That single fact dissolves a lot of impossible numbers. The third angle is the modern one. Between 2017 and 2021, the United States government openly discussed unidentified aerial phenomena, and some of those discussions included objects that appeared to move between air and water. That idea, called transmedium travel, echoes the old fast mover lore almost exactly. It has revived interest in cases like AUTEC, even though no detailed declassified sonar trace from those specific events has ever been released to the public. The numbers grew in the retelling. The primary records stayed locked away. And so the fast movers remain a story the deep refuses to either confirm or kill. A secret range could not explain its own contacts. But the next case happened in open water, in front of an entire community, and the military still came up empty. Number 4. The Fury and Hecla Strait ping. Far in the Canadian Arctic, in the territory of Nunavut, there is a narrow channel called the Fury and Hecla Strait. It connects two larger bodies of water and runs near the community of Igloolik. In 2016, the people who hunt these waters began reporting something strange rising from the seabed. It was a pinging sound, a beeping. Some described it as audible through the hulls of their boats. For an Inuit hunting community, the next part was the real alarm. The strait is normally rich with life. Seals and whales pass through it in numbers that feed families. But the animals had grown scarce. Hunters connected the two facts directly. Something was pinging beneath the water, and the wildlife had fled. This case is unusual because it did not stay a rumor. The Canadian Department of National Defence acknowledged the reports. The Royal Canadian Air Force sent a CP-140 Aurora, a long-range maritime patrol aircraft packed with sensors, to survey the area. The aircraft swept the strait. It detected 2 pods of whales and 6 walruses, and it found no source for the sound. No vessel, no device, no anomaly on any sensor. The investigation closed without an answer. The proposed explanations cover the full range. The first is a passing vessel. A survey ship or a boat using an echo sounder or sonar could produce a ping that travels far under Arctic conditions. The second is environmental. A marine mammal sound or a natural noise could have been misread by ear in a quiet, frozen place. The third explanation circulated locally and was more pointed. Some suspected deliberate acoustic deterrence, devices meant to drive animals away from a proposed mining or shipping route. Each theory has a logic. None of them was ever confirmed. There are good physical reasons the source stayed hidden. Sound under sea ice and through a narrow channel can travel and distort in ways that make a distant noise feel local. The Arctic has almost no continuous acoustic monitoring, so there were no permanent hydrophones to capture and triangulate the signal, and no recording verified by independent acoustic scientists was ever produced for study. The reports drew international coverage in November of that year, framed everywhere as the Arctic mystery ping, and local politicians in Nunavut pressed for answers. The pattern of animals fleeing a novel sound is itself well documented, which made the wildlife decline feel like corroboration rather than coincidence. We have ear witnesses, a fleeing ecosystem, and a military survey that found nothing. The case remains officially unexplained. A ping that came once and vanished is haunting enough. But there is a sound in the Pacific that has never stopped, and after more than 30 years, no one can point to what is making it. Number 5. The Upsweep. In 1991, scientists at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Pacific Marine Environmental Laboratory began noticing a sound. They were listening through the Navy's old SOS-US hydrophone arrays, the same seabed listening post built to track Soviet submarines, now feeding a civilian project that monitors the ocean's natural noise. The new sound did not match anything obvious. They named it Upsweep. Upsweep is a long train of narrow tones that rise in pitch, each lasting several seconds, repeating over and over. It is loud enough and low enough that it travels across the entire Pacific through the deep sound channel. Researchers were able to broadly localize it to the South Pacific in a remote region near volcanic seamount activity, around 54 degrees south, 140 degrees west, and it has a rhythm tied to the calendar. The sound peaks in spring and in autumn, a strong seasonal pattern that points away from anything man-made. The leading hypothesis is volcanic. The most likely engine for Upsweep is an undersea volcano, where seawater meets lava and steam and resonates, producing those rising tones. It is a clean idea. The trouble is that no specific vent, no single eruption, has ever been confirmed as the source. The researchers, including Christopher Fox and his colleagues at the laboratory, documented the sound in detail, watched its amplitude decline somewhat after the early 1990s, and still could not put a pin on the exact spot on the seafloor. Compare this to the most famous mystery sound of all, the bloop, which was eventually attributed to ice quakes, the cracking of vast sheets of Antarctic ice. The bloop got an answer. Upsweep did not. Its narrow, repetitive, rising structure is unlike the broadband noise of biology or breaking ice, which makes it stand apart from the usual suspects. It sits in the family of named ocean mysteries alongside the Whistle, the Train, the Slowdown, the Julia, and the Bloop, and it is one of the few that remains genuinely open. To confirm a volcanic source, scientists would need to place instruments directly on remote South Pacific seamounts and catch the sound being born. That is enormously difficult and expensive in waters that far from anywhere. So, Upsweep stands as the benchmark case of a signal we have recorded for decades, mapped roughly, explained plausibly, and never actually found. The seafloor's volcanic life is mostly unwatched, and Upsweep is the proof that something down there has been singing the whole time. Not every long mystery stays unsolved, though. There is one sound that baffled submarine crews for half a century, and then, almost suddenly, science caught it in the act. Number 6. The bioduck. Since the 1960s, submarine crews in the southern hemisphere had been hearing a strange, rhythmic quacking in the water. It rose mostly in winter and spring in the Southern Ocean and off Australia. It sounded like a duck made of low-frequency pulses, a repeating train of sound with an almost mechanical regularity. The crews could not find a source. Oceanographers could not either. For roughly 5 decades, this sound, eventually nicknamed the bioduck, was one of the longest-standing acoustic mysteries in the sea. The debate ran in circles for years. Was it biological? Was it a fish or some unknown creature? Was it mechanical, the sound of another Navy's submarines, or some hidden machinery? Was it geophysical? The groan of the seabed itself? The regularity of the pulses made some listeners suspect a human origin. Nothing fit cleanly, and the sound kept returning, season after season, just out of reach. The answer arrived in 2014. A research team led by Denise Risch attached acoustic recording tags directly to Antarctic minke whales. These tags ride on the animal and capture sound right at the source. And there it was. The minke whales were making the bioduck. The finding was published in the journal Biology Letters, and it solved a mystery that was older than the careers of the scientists who cracked it. Why did it take 50 years? Because the minke whale is elusive. It rarely surfaces in a way that draws attention. And the Southern Ocean is one of the harshest places on Earth to do fieldwork. The sound and the animal were never in the same frame until biologging technology made it possible to put a microphone on the whale's back. Once the data lined up, the seasonal timing and the geography matched minke distribution perfectly. Before the answer arrived, the candidate list had grown long and strange. Some proposed fish. Some proposed the submarines of other navies running quiet. Some proposed unknown machinery on the seabed. The very regularity that pointed toward a machine was, in the end, the signature of an animal keeping time. Acoustic tags of the kind used in the study, devices that record sound right against the body, had only recently matured into reliable field tools, which is the real reason the case waited half a century for its answer. The bioduck matters in this story for a specific reason. It is the hopeful counterexample. It shows that we detected it but could never find it is sometimes a temporary condition, a gap that technology eventually closes. Submarine sonar logs were among the earliest evidence, which ties this mystery directly to naval operations, and yet the final answer came from a small tag and a patient research team. Questions still linger about what the sound is for, possibly feeding, possibly communication. But the source is no longer unknown. That should be reassuring. And then you remember the cases where there was no whale to find. Only a navy convinced that something was hiding in its own waters, hunting it for years and never catching it once. Number 7. The Swedish Phantom submarines. Through the 1980s, Sweden believed it was being invaded under the water. Again and again, its forces reported foreign submarines slipping into its territorial waters. The country went on a near-constant submarine hunt, and the chase shaped its politics and its sense of safety for a decade. The strange part is what those hunts produced and what they did not. There was one undeniable, almost absurd, real event. In 1981, a Soviet submarine, designated U-137, also known by the hull number SE-363, ran aground near the Swedish naval base at Karlskrona. It sat there, stuck on the rocks, in restricted waters, in plain view. The press called it Whiskey on the Rocks, because it was a whiskey-class boat. This was not a phantom. It was a genuine Soviet submarine caught in Swedish waters, and it proved that incursions were real. After U-137, Sweden's guard went up and the sonar contacts multiplied. In October 1982 came the most intense episode, the Stein Incident, a hunt for a suspected submarine in the waters near Stockholm. The Swedish Navy dropped depth charges. They sealed off areas. They chased the contacts with everything they had, and nothing surfaced. No intruder was captured. A government submarine defense commission in 1983 concluded that Soviet submarines had violated Swedish waters, and Sweden lodged formal diplomatic protests. Then, over later years, the story complicated itself. Acousticians took a hard look at the contacts. The marine biologists Magnus Wahlberg and Håkan Westerberg demonstrated that schooling herring release clouds of gas bubbles, and those bubbles produce a distinctive high-frequency sound. In other words, some of the contacts that a tense Navy had read as submarines may have been fish. The research earned them an Ig Nobel Prize in 2004, an award for science that makes you laugh and then think. So the case split into two camps that still argue today. One camp holds that real Soviet incursions happened and points to track marks on the seabed as evidence of mini-submarines or divers. The other camp argues that a nation under pressure saw threats in ambiguous noise, and that the Baltic is an acoustic nightmare, with low salinity, strange layering, and a maze of islands that scatter sound. Decades of hunting produced exactly one captured intruder, the one that grounded itself. The lesson is uncomfortable. National security can shape how people read a sonar screen, and the line between a real submarine and a school of herring can blur when fear is doing the listening. Even after the Cold War, the archives never fully settled how many incursions were real. A Navy chased ghosts in salt water. The last case is the most famous body of water in the world for hidden monsters, and in 1987, a fleet of boats went looking with sound. Number 8. Loch Ness, Operation Deepscan. Loch Ness in Scotland is the most legendary monster water on Earth. But the most interesting thing that ever happened there was not a blurry photograph. It was a serious scientific search. In October 1987, a project called Operation Deepscan set out to sweep the entire loch with sonar. It was organized by the naturalist Adrian Shine and the Loch Ness Project, and it approached the question with instruments rather than excitement. The plan was elegant. A line of around 24 small boats, each fitted with a Lowrance echo sounder, would move down the loch in formation. Together, their sonar beams formed a kind of curtain, a moving wall of sound that anything large in the water column would have to pass through. Loch Ness is a serious body of water, about 37 kilometers long and up to 230 meters deep, filled with dark, peat-stained freshwater that makes seeing anything by eye almost impossible. Sonar was the only honest way to look. During the sweep, the operation recorded 3 unexplained contacts in mid-water. They were described as larger than a fish, but smaller than a boat. Technicians from Lowrance who reviewed the traces reportedly could not easily explain them. And critically, the contacts were not relocated on later passes. Whatever the sonar caught, it did not appear again, and no animal was ever identified. The explanations are the careful ones you would expect. The first is that the contacts were debris, sunken logs, or false returns from thermal and density layers in the water. The second is biological, perhaps a large fish such as a sturgeon, a tight school of fish, or one of the seals that occasionally wander into the loch. Shine himself never claimed a monster. He treated the survey as a measurement and the 3 contacts as data points that remained open. The story gained a modern chapter in 2018 when a team led by Neil Gemmell sampled environmental DNA from the loch, the traces of genetic material that every living thing sheds into the water. They found no sign of any large reptile. What they did find, in abundance, was eel DNA. That gave rise to the large eel hypothesis, the idea that some sightings might involve unusually big eels rather than anything prehistoric, and yet the 3 Deepscan contacts have never been definitively explained. This is the rare cryptid case that produced real instrument data instead of just eyewitness stories. A fleet of boats, a wall of sound, and 3 returns that would not resolve and would not return. It is the perfect place to stop counting, because it shows the pattern in its clearest form. We detected something, we could not find it, and that gap between detection and identity is not an accident. It is built into the ocean itself. So why does the deep do this to us again and again? The answer lies in the physics of sound. To understand why the sea can register something and then hide it, you have to understand how sound behaves underwater. Near a depth of about 1,000 meters lies a layer called the Deep Sound Channel, the SOFAR channel. Within it, low-frequency sound bends back on itself instead of escaping, and it can travel for thousands of kilometers with almost no loss. Sound also moves fast in water, around 1,500 meters per second, roughly 4.3 times faster than in air. Those two facts together break human intuition about distance. The water column is not uniform. Temperature and salinity change with depth, and those changes refract sound, bending its path the way a lens bends light. This creates shadow zones where a loud source goes silent, and it creates false targets where reflections fold back to make one object look like several. A contact that seems close and fast may be distant and ordinary, its range and speed warped by the path the sound took to reach the sensor. This single principle dissolves much of the mystery in the cases we have walked through. The quackers that seem to circle a submarine, the fast movers that seem to scream across a trench, the ping that seem to rise from directly below, the upsweep that seems to come from one spot but cannot be pinned down. Each is, at heart, a problem of acoustic geometry. The deep ocean is an echo chamber that hides direction. Recording a sound is easy. Finding what made it is the hard part. Hydrophone spacing matters enormously here. A single listening post can give you a bearing, a direction, but never a true position. To pin a source, you need several widely separated sensors hearing the same sound at the same time, and the ocean has very few of those. A bearing-only contact is an arrow pointing into the dark, not a dot on a map. There is a second trap. The water column changes with the seasons, so a sound that is loud and easy to hear in autumn can fall into a shadow zone in summer, which is one reason the same listeners reach different conclusions in different months. Estimates of range and speed all depend on assuming a sound path, and if that assumption is wrong, every number derived from it is wrong too. The physics, not human failure, is why identification so often lags behind detection. That is the natural world's contribution to the mystery, but the instruments we build have their own blind spots, and those blind spots have a long and secret history. There are two basic ways to hunt with sound, and each fails in its own way. Passive sonar simply listens. It is stealthy, because it gives nothing away, but it is also bearing only, which means it tells you the direction of a sound and not its range. Active sonar does the opposite. It sends out a ping and times the echo, which gives you distance, but it also announces your presence to everyone and floods the water with returns that bounce off every layer and bubble. Both methods are easy to fool. Schools of fish and clouds of gas bubbles can mimic the hard echo of a solid hull. A ping aimed across a thermal layer can produce a phantom that looks like a target sitting in open water. The herring that may have haunted the Swedish hunts are the perfect example. A biological chorus became, to a tense operator, an enemy submarine. Many of the listening posts in these stories trace back to one Cold War system. Beginning in the 1950s, the United States built the SOSUS network, a chain of seabed hydrophones designed to track Soviet submarines across whole ocean basins. It was classified for decades. Later, those same arrays were opened to ocean science, which is how the laboratory that found Upsweep had ears in the deep Pacific at all. Military hardware became a scientific instrument. Operator training sits underneath all of it. Reading a passive sonar display is a skill built on expectation, and expectation can be steered by context. A crew told to watch for intruders will find more intruders in the same ambiguous trace. The cost of being wrong runs both ways. A false positive sends a navy chasing a phantom, as it did in Sweden. A false negative lets a real contact slip away unidentified, as it did in the Arctic and at Loch Ness. Different jobs use different tools. The Lowrance echo sounders strung across Loch Ness were a form of active sonar, applied carefully and in formation. They had the resolution of 1980s consumer gear, good enough to catch 3 contacts and not good enough to say what they were. Modern multi-beam systems and autonomous underwater vehicles do far better mapping the seabed in fine detail and listening for months at a time. And yet even modern gear leaves gaps because the ocean is vast and our sensors are few. The detection identification gap is not a relic, it is a permanent feature, and secrecy only widens it. A surprising number of these cases stay open not because the ocean is mysterious, but because the records are missing. The Cold War wrapped naval acoustics in deep secrecy. Test vehicles, quiet drones, and experimental sensors were run in waters where other crews had no idea what was being tested. An undisclosed friendly asset, seen by an operator who was never briefed, becomes an unidentified contact almost automatically. The Quackers and the fast movers were born in exactly that kind of environment. The system that found Upsweep SOSUS was itself classified for decades, which meant the very tool that could resolve a mystery was hidden from the people who might have solved it. And when declassification finally comes, it often arrives too late. Witnesses retire or die. Logs are lost. A transient event that lasted 20 minutes in 1970 can never be re-examined because there is nothing left to examine. Without primary sources, even a real event collapses into anecdote. The grounding of U-137 is the exception that proves the rule. It was undeniable because the submarine sat on the rocks in daylight. Almost every other Swedish contact stayed ambiguous because navies do not like to confirm sensitive detections, and the public record filled with rumor instead of data. The same is true across these stories. Memoirs and post-collapse disclosures gave us the Quackers. Remote geography gave us thin monitoring in the Arctic and the South Pacific. The tension between security and openness keeps even mundane cases unsolved because the evidence that would settle them is either classified, lost, or never gathered. Step back, and the scale of our ignorance becomes the real story. Less than a quarter of the global seafloor is mapped at high resolution. The International Seabed 2030 effort is working to change that, but for now, most of the bottom of the ocean is less precisely known than the surface of the moon. Continuous acoustic monitoring covers only a tiny fraction of the water at any moment, which means that most of the ocean is not being listened to at all. So, which of these mysteries can still be solved? The bioduct shows the template. A long, unidentified sound was cracked the instant the right technology, an acoustic tag, was pointed at the right animal. Upsweep is probably solvable in the same spirit if instruments can be placed on the remote seamounts where it likely originates. Expanding libraries of animal sounds and new machine classification tools will quietly resolve many cases that once seemed alien. Autonomous gliders and long-duration hydrophone arrays will fill in the gaps that a single ship never could. Other cases are likely lost forever. The transient Cold War contacts heard once and never recorded for independent study have no evidence left to test. The colossal squid size question behind the Stein incident stays open because the largest individuals are rarely caught, and most known specimens come from the stomachs of sperm whales or from accidental catches that may not represent a full-grown adult. Even the eel DNA at Loch Ness, suggestive as it is, cannot explain 3 specific sonar returns from 1987. What detection without identification really teaches is humility. The absence of an answer is not proof of a monster, and it is not proof of nothing. It is simply the honest edge of what we know. The thread running through all 8 of these cases is the same. The instruments insisted, the identity refused. A sonar screen, a gouged dome, a fleeing pod of seals, a tone rising through the deep, all of them say the same thing. Something was here. And then the trail goes cold. The deep ocean is the last place on Earth large enough and dark enough to swallow a contact whole. To detect something without being able to find it is a strange kind of intimacy. You know it was there. You felt its presence on your screen or in your hull. You simply cannot say what it was. That discomfort, the confirmed but unidentified presence, is older than sonar and older than submarines. It is the feeling of standing at the edge of the known. Sometimes technology closes the gap, and a 50-year mystery turns out to be a shy whale singing in the cold. Sometimes the gap stays open, and a sound keeps rising from the South Pacific year after year with no name. Both outcomes are worth respecting because both are honest. There is dignity in admitting we do not know, and there is a pull in these stories precisely because they refuse to resolve. Each one is a reminder that the sea can hand us a fact, the fact of a presence, while withholding the meaning behind it. Somewhere right now, a hydrophone is recording a return that no one will ever explain. The screen holds the mark, the ocean keeps the answer, and the search goes on.